One of the more terrifying topics in international conflict is the role of weapons of mass destruction, specifically nuclear weapons. And there's a whole set of strategy and calculation that goes into how weapons of mass destruction affect international politics. And so I think we should probably dig into that a little bit. So I want to begin with maybe a definitional issue. When we talk about weapons of mass destruction, there's the international definition, which includes nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons, which sort of fall into this special class of unconventional weapons. But the US government actually has a different legal definition for a weapon of mass destruction. In the US sort of legal context, it's an indiscriminate weapon, whether it's, they could kill multiple people. And so a pipe bomb would be classified as a weapon of mass destruction. And so if you follow the news, you might occasionally see that somebody was arrested for, planning to use a weapon of mass destruction. Most likely it's in the context of a pipe bomb, not in the context of the international weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, chemical, or biological weapons. But even within the international definition, there's a wide range of how much destruction these things include, right? And so on one end, for nuclear weapons, you have hydrogen bombs, which can level entire cities. On the low end, you might have what we would call a dirty bomb, which could be used in a terrorist attack and would spread sort of radiological material all over the place and could increase cancer rates or birth defects and would be just very painful and difficult and slow to clean up and could cause lots of panic and fear and damage. Within the chemical range, on the low end, you've got something like, military grade tear gas. On the high end, you've got VX nerve gas, which depending upon deployment, depending upon wind and all these other factors, could be as deadly for a city as a nuclear weapon. It's a highly, highly deadly neurotoxin. And then biological, we could see the Black Death, the bubonic plague, something that could kill, untold millions of people on one end. On the other end, salmonella, which has actually been used in terrorist attacks in the past. Okay, so we've got some definitional issues. We're talking about weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, nuclear. One of the frameworks that we use to think about the strategy or the tactics of using these weapons is this idea of the offense-defense balance. And in sort of just very simple terms, this is what international relations scholars describe when they're talking about whether or not it makes sense to attack or whether it makes sense to defend, whether the advantage is for the attacker or defense. And that's a function of the strategies that are being deployed in warfare, the ideas people have about how you achieve military objectives, but also the technology of warfare. So for a long time, the dominant technology of warfare was the castle. Castles are very difficult to storm. They create sort of a situation in which offenses or defense has the advantage, but castles also have the advantage of being, sort of stationary. It's hard to use a castle to attack someone. And so a castle is very much a defensive technology. And that really anchors the international balance as something that is very lopsided toward defense and toward stability. In the middle part of the 1450 era, the Ottoman Turks show up at the gates of Constantinople with cannon, and they blow through the castle walls in the afternoon and storm in, and all of a sudden castles are no longer an effective military technology. All of a sudden cannon have made the advantage with the attacker, and suddenly the entire international system shifts in a way that's much more unstable and much more war prone. So this idea of technology shaping whether or not it makes sense to attack or defend gets applied to nuclear weapons. We can walk through the logic about how this works. And so if one country and one country alone has nuclear weapons, then that is an incredibly powerful tool of war, and we wouldn't or shouldn't be surprised if we see states using that tool of warfare because it's effective. And certainly when the United States develops nuclear weapons, it's very quick to deploy them in World War II. And there's no sense of retaliation or this would be inappropriate or that these weapons are somehow unusual or unique. So one country has nuclear weapons, they're going to be inclined to use it as a tool of warfare. When two states have nuclear weapons, specifically when they have lots of them, when the arsenals are massive, and they've been able to deploy them in a way that it gives them a secure second strike. We'll talk about that in a little bit, what goes into a secure second strike. But when that happens, nuclear weapons turn into defensive weapons. They become the biggest, baddest castles out there that mankind has ever generated because nobody wants to use nuclear weapons to attack another country because using nuclear weapons could result in a retaliatory strike that would end life on Earth and would be massively destructive. And so the only reason to have nuclear weapons is as a deterrent, right? As a big looming castle that says, "Do not attack me; it will be disastrous for you." Right? That's the logic of nuclear weapons when multiple states have them, and there's the secure second strike. But if we add in when you have multiple countries with nuclear weapons and one country has defensive technology, what I mean by that is things like missile defense systems, where you can shoot down incoming missiles and do so effectively, then suddenly the calculation gets really messy and nuclear weapons sort of shift again into offensive tools of war, where you would use the weapons that you have to wipe out an opponent's arsenal or to launch a preemptive strike and try to overwhelm a missile defense system. The logic of attacking suddenly takes on a whole new level of intensity. And so when we try to talk about how nuclear weapons affect the international system, we have to tell that sort of broader story about how all these pieces are intersecting. Okay, so one of the critical pieces in terms of how that logic plays out is this idea of a secure second strike. And so I think it's worth talking about what that means and what that looks like. Because without a secure second strike, the advantage is almost always going to be with the attacker in nuclear war. The ability to strike first, to destroy an opponent's arsenal, the ability to strike first and overwhelm whatever systems they have in place is going to give an advantage to the attacker. During the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union relied upon multiple delivery vehicles. And so the United States deployed a global system of radar installations to be able to detect incoming missiles so that they could identify, okay, we're under attack, how are we going to launch? And the United States developed a massive land-based network of missile silos across the upper Midwest where North Dakota is located, as well as airborne bombers. And it's the idea of these bombers that you would always have bombers in the air ready to go with enough fuel to reach Moscow or their bombing destination, loaded with nuclear armed weapons, so that if a strike came, they would just simply shift course and execute a bombing run. And there wouldn't be any possibility of destroying the bombers on the ground. And as soon as their fuel reserves drop to a point where they're not going to be able to hit their bombing targets, they turn back. And just as they're turning back, the next wave of bombers goes up into the air, so that there's that ongoing, unbroken potential to strike at your targets. And then finally, the most locked down component of a secure second strike is to have nuclear weapons based on submarines out in the ocean, where it would be almost impossible to detect and find and destroy simultaneously the 20 or so nuclear weapons submarines that are floating around. And that if the word comes that the United States had been attacked or the Soviet Union had been attacked, those submarines could simply just pop up, launch their arsenals, and deliver a devastating counterstrike. So there's a lot of components to that, and the critical piece is you couldn't possibly overwhelm all of those pieces all at once, and there's no possible way to launch a surprise attack where you would be able to prevent communication or mechanisms from being able to execute that second strike, right? So there's a lot that goes into that. There's the logistics, there's the communication, systems that have to be secure. The political systems have to be secure. During the Cold War, the U.S. actually rewrote the Constitution to have a chain of command that would be clear, so that even if a huge swath of the U.S. government was obliterated in a surprise nuclear strike, there would always be some person who would be in the chain of command who could then authorize that retaliatory strike. But again, this is really a lot of moving pieces, and very few countries really are in a position to put all that in place. And so I'll point to India and Pakistan, two of the more recent nuclear armed states that have this rivalry. Their arsenals are generally considered too small to be able to deliver the kind of world-ending cataclysmic destruction that we would see during the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Although, in fairness, it looks like a nuclear war between India and Pakistan would probably evaporate the Earth's ozone, so it would still be cataclysmic above and beyond the destruction of the people involved directly. But it's unlikely that you're going to be able to rain down thousands and thousands of warheads. And in fact, it's possible that India could launch a preemptive strike and destroy Pakistan's nuclear arsenal on the ground. And so that's created this sort of anxiety on the part of Pakistan about how do we make sure that our weapons are secure. One approach is to simply move the weapons around, right? Put them on mobile missile stations and make it so that the Indian government never knows where they are, because they're always moving around Pakistan, and that would create a level of uncertainty that would maybe act as a secure second strike. Other technical issues that we've noticed here. So a number of years back, there was a Malaysian passenger airplane that went missing. And one of the hypotheses was that maybe it had been hijacked and flown across India into Afghanistan. And the Indian government had to admit that, no, they actually don't have radar installations up on that sort of northern part of the country where you would potentially see missiles or planes coming in a conflict between India and Pakistan. So having all of the detection infrastructure, the response infrastructure to be able to target things correctly, it's really a sophisticated piece, which is one of the reasons why the logic of nuclear weapons can be very messy at times. Okay, so when we talk about how messy the logic of nuclear weapons can be, people generally position themselves into one of two camps. So there's those who tend to advocate for the logic of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, M-A-D, or those who argue for nuclear utilization theory, the nuts, N-U-T, as a way to think about your nuclear arsenal. So if you're on the mutually assured destruction side of things, then you look at this and say, the most stable scenario is where two countries have massive nuclear arsenals, and they both understand the logic of secure second strike, and they both understand that if one side launches at the other side's going to retaliate, and it's going to be cataclysmic destruction. And because of that, everybody does everything that they possibly can do to make sure that it never escalates to nuclear war. And that might mean being fully transparent, right? It might mean bringing an adversary in and showing them your command and control structure, showing them all the different delivery vehicles, trying to make it as clear as possible that nuclear war is going to be a cataclysmic thing and we should never, ever try to fight it. Nuclear utilization theory sort of turns in that and says, yeah, but that's making the calculation that your adversary is able to think through the logic of, if I launch, there's going to be a retaliatory strike and it's going to be completely devastating for my country and potentially life on Earth, and that's a compelling argument for your adversary. If your adversary is just sort of crazy, then maybe that doesn't work. Maybe they're willing to do something that's, world ending. And if you're going to be responsible, you should prepare to fight and win a nuclear war. And so that might mean developing defensive capabilities, right? So can you shoot down incoming missiles? Do you have fighter jets that can shoot down incoming bombers, right? Do you have the kind of infrastructure so that you could absorb a strike on your country and still come out okay? Whether that's very deep mine shafts where radiation won't penetrate, or whether that's air raid sirens and all that stuff, trying to make it so that your country has the best likelihood of surviving a nuclear strike. Secondly, you want to develop offensive capabilities so that you can launch a preemptive strike without detection. And so things like stealth technology would be very useful, so that you can fly in bombers and hit your adversary's arsenal and destroy it on the ground before it's ever launched. That would be very useful. Maybe the ability to hack into computer systems or radar systems. Back in 2006, there was a strike by Israel on a nuclear facility in Syria, and it seems to be that the Israeli bombers were able to fly into Syria and the radar just simply didn't see them, perhaps because the radar systems had been hacked and they were able to sort of project a little bubble of invisibility around those bombers as they went in and executed their bombing run and then left Syrian airspace. So all that would fit into this idea of being able to launch a preemptive strike to put you in a better position to fight and win a nuclear war. So that leads us into this idea of missile defense. This is something that the United States has been pursuing on various different levels since the early 1980s. It's generally assumed that this is a good thing for the United States to be doing. I'm of the view that this has not been fully debated and worked through in terms of the logic of it. And so I'd like to kind of give you some of the pros and cons of why missile defense might not be all it's cracked up to be. Right. So if I was going to make the best argument I could possibly make for missile defense, I would say, look, missile defense isn't going to work against a full, mutually assured destruction kind of scenario. This is for crazy states that are erratic or have governments led by fanatics who want to initiate a world-ending apocalypse. And so it just makes sense that you prepare to shoot down 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 incoming missiles launched by these fanatical states that simply cannot be deterred. And that any discussion about how MAD was able to work in the Cold War really just is a different world where there was just mostly two countries with these massive nuclear arsenals, and they could study each other and understand each other. But today, there's so many states with nuclear weapons, and there's just the likelihood of making mistakes. It would be irresponsible not to have this capacity. So the counter argument to that, which is a fairly be prepared kind of argument, is that pursuing missile defense systems really does risk destabilizing whatever logic of MAD exists in the international system, right? Because once you start developing that capacity, suddenly nuclear weapons stop being defensive technology. They stop being castles, and they start being something that you use as a calculation of, is this a tool of war that I could use? And you end up increasing the likelihood that either the country with missile defense is going to launch an attack on someone else with nuclear weapons, thinking that they can shoot down whatever comes at them, or that another state worried about a missile defense system might try to overwhelm that system by launching everything that they have all at once. And so you're actually increasing the likelihood of a really cataclysmically bad thing. So that's a problem. But the bigger issue, from my perspective, is that missile defense is expensive. $15+ billion every year is invested in these programs, and there doesn't seem to be any real benefit. And what I mean by that is, no one launches a missile at a country with effective missile defense. If you are one of these crazy states that apparently can't be deterred and wants to blow up a nuclear weapon, you don't put it on a missile and launch it across the Pacific or the Atlantic or over the Arctic, hoping that the United States won't shoot it down. If you really want to launch a nuclear strike on the United States, you deploy it in some unconventional way, right? In a shipping container, or in a small submarine, or in a truck full of kitty litter crossing the border. There's lots of ways to move a nuclear weapon into an area where it would be close to a US city and detonate it that wouldn't require a missile. And therefore, as soon as you develop this missile defense capacity, all you're really doing is shifting the delivery mechanism to something that's less conventional. And so I don't personally see a huge security gain in developing this kind of technology. And I don't think that argument has really been sort of worked through to its conclusion. And so I'm just sort of throwing that out there as a way of thinking about how missile defense might affect the broader security logic of nuclear conflict.